Okay, good morning. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to present a co-authored paper with two other colleagues, Yann Algan and Daniel Cohen. So this paper, and sorry many apologize for you, Yves, because it's not really a paper, it's not really a book, it's something between both.
It's a paper in progress.
Yes, exactly. So in progress piece, for which we were concerned about the rise of populism, as in different European countries. And what I'm going to present this morning is a combination of different hypotheses to identify new cleavages in French politics, and especially on the classical sociodemographic cleavage, and the role of well-being or life satisfaction to better understand what classical sociodemographics features don't do. We have some elementary question about the role of income, education, and so on, and we try to look at differently the impact of such features. But before going on this point, and I would like to go back on two different elements that we focus on. The first is the role of emotions, or the role of psychology to understand vote choice in France. So I just want to present very briefly some elements on psychology for the French election, but also because we were able to replicate the same analysis for German elections. So I don't want to go on the afternoon session, but to see that something is very common to France and Germany about the role of emotion, and not all emotions, specifically the role of anger and not anxiety, to understand the rise of populism, the rise of extreme right parties. So in France, my argument will consist to say that voters choose extreme parties not for the same sociological or attitudinal reasons. In France, it doesn't work. It works in some other countries, but not in France. So just to put aside this element about data, all results I'm going to present are based on a French National Election Survey that I share with some colleagues at CVPOF and at Sciences Po. It's a huge survey, online panel during 18 months with 17 waves. And we have a huge sample of 25,000 respondents from wave 1, and due to attrition for the last wave, 14,000 people were still alive. So I will present different independent variables and specifically on demographics and well-being. So. Just to go back on, because for us, there are two new cleavages for this 2017 French election. First is the role of emotions, and secondly, the role of well-being. And it's totally different in the sense that they do not overlap each other. So just to basically, the role of psychology or emotions is very, probably relevant, more relevant than other classical sociodemographics variable to understand the rise of populism. Because if we go back on the US election or Brexit referendum, we have read many observers, people saying that if we want to understand the rise of populism, it's just because voters feel so anxious or feel feared about the future, about the lack of protection, and so on. The reality is quite different, because if we see the two main emotions, the two main opposite emotions, fear and anger, and we plot the effect of both emotions on the probability of voting for Le Pen, you see in France, for fear, people who feel more anxious about the future, about the political system, about the economic situation. The more people feel fear, the less they are likely to vote for Le Pen, extreme right party. At the opposite, anger has a huge and significant positive effect. So if we look at now on the left-right scale, because you may assume that it's just because people on the left or on the right have some ideological predisposition to feel more anxious or angry. In reality, you see that only the red line on the right graph display the impact of anger and not fear on the left side of this graph to explain the probability for voting Le Pen. And what we observe in France is also the same in Germany, with a different effect for fear. Fear seems to be less significant than in France, but only anger as emotion, as a disruptive emotion, is relevant to explain the rise of AfD. And if we replicate the same graph, we see that anger is a strong predictor for explaining the rise of populism. So it means that regarding all what has been written, newspapers and so on, fear is not the important or the significant element to understand the rise of such extreme right leaders. So for this French election, we were concerned about the role of classical sociodemographic variable, income and education. And we argue that due to their simultaneous effect, income and education may hide other cleavages. So we have three questions. First is what explains that Le Pen voters among the poorest in the electorate stand against distribution and siding with their conservative leader, François Fillon. Second question, why do they oppose the far-left leader, Mélenchon, with whom they share about the same average level of income? And finally, the key question, why do poor people vote for far-right? So let me start with the representation of both variable, income and education. So I just replicate for the two last presidential elections, 2012 and 2017. So what we see is probably a difference that I could have with what Hans-Peter mentioned this in the previous session about the closeness between Macron and Socialist Party. I know that it's not based on the same variables, but you see that it's very, what is striking is the similarities between both elections. We have talked a lot about this disruptive election in 2017, this earthquake in political French politics, in French politics. But I mean, the only difference between both elections is for Socialist Party, who has totally disappeared. Not only in terms of vote share, but also in terms of location of the electorate. So we see that Le Pen voters have lower education and lower revenues in both elections. Mélenchon far-left voters are also those who did not vote have average education but low revenue in both years, so it's common. It's the same for Fillon and Sarkozy, higher income and average education, and Macron is alone in this space with higher income and higher education. So if we change the perspective of the role of education and income, we see, I mean, after regression about education and income, it's important to know that in the choice to vote for Le Pen and Macron, education and income are equally important. But in the choice to vote for Fillon and Mélenchon, income is a bit more important than education. On this slide, we just build this line representing how much money someone can expect to make on average given their level of income, and without taking any other information into account. So someone to the right of the line is making more money than one might expect given their level of education, and someone to the left of the line is making less money than what might expect given their level of education. So this graph in 2017 suggests that extreme voters, populist voters, make only slightly less than their education level would predict. So it doesn't mean that they are satisfied, and we will see that they are deeply unsatisfied, but their inclination to extremism, populism, may not arise with the disappointment and sense of frustration that may be motivating Mélenchon on the left, Mélenchon voters. So the question is how to explain differences between two categories of extreme voters, Mélenchon and Le Pen. So it's not just a question of education. First, Mélenchon voters see the French society and probably Europe as unfair, but at the opposite of Le Pen voters, Mélenchon voters think that they can fix this unfair society by redistribution. And they do not portray themselves as different from Fillon voters, only less successful financially. Le Pen voters, at the opposite, are more radical. They do not even trust the system enough to believe in redistributive politics. And that's the main difference. The third dimension to understand the opposing location of the electorate is the role of well-being. So we use this concept of well-being. There are different definitions of well-being. So we have only used a battery of questions about life satisfaction. So life satisfaction today, anticipated life satisfaction in 5 years, comparison of life satisfaction, comparison with parents, comparison with grandparents. So what we see on this graph, so this graph shows the average level of two variables, two types of well-being, subjective well-being across candidates. And what we see, only two candidates are at the left, Le Pen and Mélenchon, so meaning people thinking that their level of well-being is much lower for themselves or compared to grandparents, compared to parents, or people are more likely to vote for extreme parties. And if I represent, it's my preferred graph, because it goes against like a conventional wisdom about the role of income to explain extreme right vote. This graph shows that we cannot say that Le Pen voters or National Front is the party of poor voters. It's not that. Front National is more the party of unhappy voters and not poor voters. Because if we see, according to the distribution of different categories of income, you see whatever the level of income, the proportion of people voting for Front National, National Front, is independent from the level of income. What is decisive is the level of well-being, of life satisfaction. And we see a decreasing slope for people feeling more comfortable, more satisfied with their own situation. That's the only component able to explain the decrease of Le Pen vote choice. The same representation but with more capacity to locate different electorates. If we look at on the y-axis, life satisfaction, it's a log, well-being, and horizontally you have the average income. The line represents the average level of life satisfaction at each level of income. So it's like a benchmark. And what we see we observe that those who voted for mainstream candidates, Fillon, Macron, Hamon, have life satisfaction that is higher than expected given their level of income. So they are above the line. Whereas those who have voted for the extreme candidates, Mélenchon and Le Pen, or abstained, have level of well-being that is lower than expected for their average level of revenue. So it means that revenue is not the only element to understand the move to more populism in France. I don't know how much time I...
Oh, I've not checked. So
Okay. So another cleavage, the last one, is the sources of ideological cleavage. So we have computed many and classical questions about positions, policy preferences, values, and so on. I will not describe this table. I just want to show that there is still in France an opposition, a cleavage between right and left, because we have said that after Macron's victory, that the classical right-left cleavage has disappeared in France. I think it's probably earlier to conclude on this transformation, because when we look at different positions, we see that there is still a huge cleavage between left and right voters. And especially for, the distinction on different moral issues, economic issues, we see that the closeness between Le Pen and Fillon voters is still very strong, and at the opposite, Mélenchon and Hamon have similar common values regarding redistributive politics, moral issues, and you have, for instance, homosexuality or other gender issues. That's the first cleavage. The second cleavage, I will not present all cleavage. The most important cleavage is between the last one, between Macron and Le Pen. The main opposition between both electorates is first about immigration, or I know that there is this emerging concept in some US papers about nativism. So it's very close to nativism, but we are not able to measure exactly what is nativism. Is it more close to ethnocentrism or preference for nationals and so on? But immigration is very, immigration is able to split both electorates. So you see the negative sign for immigration as good for the society, for Le Pen voters, and the opposite, Mélenchon, the highest score for this item. And for EU, Macron voters are the only one to get this such higher level of pro-European attitudes, and the opposite, strong and significant coefficient for Le Pen voters. So if we try to represent all these dimensions, we see that still Mélenchon and Le Pen are the two electorates who think that the society is unfair, and also in terms of EU attitudes, I will show on the next graph, but also they share the common view that they absolutely not trust current French representatives. So, in a sense, we have the answer of populism elites against people. Redistribution, that's interesting because redistribution is able to separate Le Pen and Mélenchon voters. Le Pen voters do not think that redistribution will be the solution of all problems. At the opposite, Mélenchon voters think that the state must intervene for more redistribution. So, conclusion. So what we try to do is to understand what is opposing Le Pen's voters and Mélenchon voters. And our first conclusion is the votes for Le Pen are not driven by social class, as I showed this figure with income and well-being. So such votes are not driven by social class, but only to one's own socioeconomic status. So it's important to have a group preference, and Macron, to a certain extent, follows the same route. For Mélenchon and Fillon, on the other hand, votes are more driven by class, regardless of one's own socioeconomic status, and are more likely to be driven by class-based ideology. So it seems that the traditional left-right cleavage remains embedded in social classes, but with this new diagonal open or closed society driven by individuals who fail or succeed. That's the importance of using well-being as an independent variable. So ideology explains most of the votes, but when we lumped with socioeconomic variables, ideology, is the more important and crash all over variables. So it's totally in line with Engelhardt and Norris that argue populism is cultural backlash. But from a methodological perspective or econometric perspective, that is clearly a weak argument, and that's the next step of this long paper. Weak argument because ideologies and votes are determined simultaneously. So the next step is to find the correct instrument to better identify the relationship between ideology and vote choice, and for that we started to use this dynamic comparison of level of well-being of people and well-being of parents and well-being of grandparents. Thank you.